two of the most feared men ever to walk the face of the earth. One obsessed with race, the other with the occult. They found a deadly common ground in the abuse of archaeology. Nazi excavations would justify their conquests, and finally, the murder of millions.
I'm John Rhys-Davies. Join me as we uncover Hitler's assault on science, next on Archaeology.
These death camps, uncovered by Allied soldiers in Germany during the closing days of the Second World War, told the true cost of Adolf Hitler's obsession with race. Millions of Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals, all considered Untermenschen, or subhuman, by the Nazis, and all consigned to the ovens at places such as Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Yet one story that has never been told is how Hitler's obsession with race bred a second deadly obsession: Nazi archaeology. Hitler declared the Germans a genetic master race, destined by blood to rule the world. Heinrich Himmler's dreaded SS dispatched archaeologists throughout Europe to prove it. Those archaeologists became the intellectual vanguard for a savage war of territorial acquisition and for an ethnic cleansing of the conquered lands that would become known simply as the final solution.
It may be one of the grimmest tales in the annals of archaeology. Not the triumph of science, but the abuse of science. True evidence suppressed, false evidence exalted. So diabolical was Himmler's assault on prehistory, and so deadly the results for the conquered peoples of Europe, that German archaeologists to this day are reluctant to admit it ever happened.
From this tranquil Midwestern campus of the University of Minnesota, Iron Age archaeologist Bettina Arnold has been swept up in a detective story reaching all the way back to the terror of the Nazi Third Reich. Arnold's investigative work is helping to write one of the ugliest and least known chapters in the history of archaeology: how German prehistorians once found themselves pressed into the service of Heinrich Himmler's SS.
Because the Nazis recognized the propaganda value of archaeology, they put an awful lot of money into it. And in the space of a very short time, from 1933 to the beginning of the war, the number of university chairs literally increased over 300% in prehistoric archaeology. In a way, you could almost argue that prehistoric archaeology in Germany today was really born during that time period.
In more than 40 years, no German prehistorian had ever written about the subject's Nazi past. The reason? Personal loyalty and fear of reprisals.
Most of the senior professors now were graduate students then, and they would no more think of, in a way, blowing the whistle on their advisors, who would have been major players in all of this as archaeological practitioners under the Nazis, than they would think of killing a parent. I don't think there's any doubt at all that there would be unbelievable peer pressure placed on a person who tried to break through the wall of silence that's been maintained on this subject.
Arnold discovered that the roots of Nazi archaeology go back to the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated a defeated Germany by stripping the country of its former territories. And in the turbulent years of the Great Depression that followed, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party won the support of millions of impoverished Germans by again laying claim to that territory and providing a heroic version of their nation's history.
They recognized that for a people to be convinced that they in fact had a destiny, they would need first to have some sense of their antecedents being as glorious as their destiny was supposed to be.
In the same way that class had defined communism, race became the organizing principle of Nazism. From the writings of prehistorians such as Gustav Cassina and party ideologist Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazis wove a crude racial dogma, preaching that much of Europe had originally belonged to the Germans, the elite descendants of a genetically superior people called the Aryans.
Well, the doctrine or the concept of racial purity had to do with the idea that this original Aryan or Indo-Germanic population had managed to maintain itself in a more or less pristine state and had developed most of the major technological advances that we normally associate with Western civilization, basically within the area that today would be considered Northern and Western Europe.
In their pageantry and politics, the Nazis venerated this mythical past. They took the swastika, an ancient Indo-European sun symbol, for their party insignia. And they believed that blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans with an athletic Grecian physique were the purest descendants of their Aryan ancestors, despite the appearance of most of the top Nazi leadership. So enamored was Hitler of Greek culture that he would occasionally harangue dinner guests with a homespun account of how that culture originated.
One of the more bizarre notions that the Nazis propagated was based in part on a pet theory of Hitler's that the Dorians were in fact a northern tribe that had migrated into the Mediterranean area and were the only survivors of some kind of a catastrophe in the north, and that they essentially then were responsible for later classical Greek civilization, which Hitler actually admired considerably.
Hitler had turned to the country's industrialists and bankers for the massive expansion in the arms industry which ended unemployment. Now, he would sponsor Germany's archaeologists for confirmation that the nation's destiny was indeed a Darwinian consequence of better blood.
There were two major agencies, one run by Heinrich Himmler and one run by Alfred Rosenberg, which both were heavily involved and provided funding sources for archaeological projects. And many of the primary scholars in Germany, the people who held the chairs in archaeology in the universities and the people who did the major field work, applied to these two agencies to have their projects funded.
Though there were exceptions, most German prehistorians welcomed the Nazis' attention to a subject which had long been confined to the basements of most German universities. But it was a Faustian bargain they had struck. In exchange for increased funding, they submitted to the iron grip of SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, a murderous bureaucrat obsessed with race and the occult, a man who would lead German archaeology into its darkest hour. September 1939, and a stunned world watched as Hitler launched a lightning war in the East, his tanks rolling in quick succession over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and then a year later, Russia. It was the Nazi war machine's hunger for raw materials which drove it forward, but Himmler's archaeologists justified the pillage as the historic reclamation of a greater Germany.
There were many digs that the SS funded. Often they were in places which were not in the heart of Germany itself, but were in areas that were being added to Germany as a result of German military expansion and fit within the program of Lebensraum, which was designed to get greater living space for the German people. And if, through archaeology, it could be demonstrated that these areas were historically German, there would be a greater justification for the current political reality of incorporating these areas either directly into Germany or into satellite states that were under German control.
The SS archaeologists swept into the occupied territories hard on the heels of the victorious Wehrmacht divisions. Among the sites Himmler's men dug were at Biskupin in Poland, Dolny Westernici in Czechoslovakia, and in Minsk, Dunneberg, and Dniepropetrovsk in the Soviet Union.
We know that the SS dug Germanic settlements on the Crimean, in the heart of Ukraine, in the heart of Russia, only to prove that Germanic tribes had settled there around AD 300, and to claim it for a greater Germany, for a big Reich in the 40s. And this is how you can abuse archaeology. And the Nazis did pretty well in that. But there were colleagues as well who refused to be serfs of this sort of nationalism, of course.
Headed by SS boss Heinrich Himmler, the organization which coordinated most Nazi digs was known as the Ahnenerbe, or Society for Cultural Heritage. Himmler was an extremist even among Nazis, obsessed with mysticism and genetic engineering. With backing from a group of wealthy capitalists called the Friends of Himmler, it was his Ahnenerbe scientists who conducted the diabolical medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. The former poultry breeder quickly bent German archaeology to his will.
SS archaeologists, part of the Ahnenerbe organization, were sent out by Himmler literally around the globe looking for objects of occult significance and archaeological significance. And Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark trilogy is to some extent based on historical fact, because in fact SS archaeologists were looking for objects like the Ark of the Covenant, like the spear that was used to pierce Christ's side when he was hanging on the cross, etc., because they were considered to be objects of power, among other things.
Few German archaeologists could have known how far Hitler and Himmler would ultimately go in the frenzied quest for racial purity. Yet their work played a crucial role in justifying the Nazi racial policies. Policies that led to mass deportations and ultimately to the gates of Auschwitz itself.
One of the ways that living space was supposed to be created was by eliminating Slavs and Poles in Eastern Europe, and this basically became easier for the Nazis when they were able to convince the public that these people were basically squatters living on lands that once belonged to Germanic peoples, and that Germanic peoples had a right to them.
Within Germany itself, Himmler's archaeologists made some of their most outlandish claims. In the 12th century, the Externstein rocks had been a sanctuary for Benedictine monks. For the Nazis, the caves were an opportunity, using fabricated evidence, to illustrate another glorious page from German prehistory.
What happened was that two archaeologists, Hermann Wirth, who was one of the founders of the SS Ahnenerbe, one of the original founders, and Julius André, who's an archaeologist, decided that this was probably the site where the so-called world tree of the Germans had been located, which was supposedly cut down by Charlemagne during the Saxon Wars, and that it had been a cult site, okay, the center of the Germanic universe, in a sense. They decided this basically before they had actually done any excavation. It seemed like a perfect location, and they then began to excavate in order to prove that that was in fact the case. And it turns out that there's absolutely no evidence for prehistoric occupation at the site whatsoever.
The Externstein digs eventually attracted such scorn from most professional archaeologists that Himmler was forced to distance himself publicly from Wirth. Privately, however, he continued to support him, cynically commenting, "Our teaching of German origins has depended for centuries on a falsification. We are entitled to impose one of our own at any time." Hitler privately regarded Himmler's archaeology as obsessive and somewhat of an embarrassment. He complained to his armaments minister, Albert Speer. Why do we call the whole world's attention to the fact that we have no past? It's bad enough that the Romans were erecting buildings when our forefathers were still living in mud huts. Now Himmler is digging up these villages of mud huts and enthusing over every pot, shard, and stone axe he finds. All we prove by that is that we were still throwing stone hatchets and crouching around open fires when Greece and Rome had already reached the highest stage of culture. The Nazi leadership's main interest in archaeology was propaganda. The work of prehistorian and filmmaker Lothar Sotz, in particular, caught the eye of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Sotz produced several films celebrating archaeologists and their attempts to recover Germany's ancient past.
Der Tode trug es während der Feuerbestattung umgegürtet. Die Scheide aus Holz oder Leder ist deshalb natürlich verbrannt. Und nur die Metallteile sind erhalten geblieben.
His films were shown widely before and during the war.
The idea was that you could reach people with images better than you could with print. Most of these people obviously never read any of the journals. But by showing SS troops sort of marching off to excavations, showing the excavations actually in progress, and with voiceover, in a way, extolling the beauties of the site on the one hand and the sort of cultural achievements of the occupants of the site on the other, and making the connection between the local population and this prehistoric population, that there's a continuous sort of line of settlement in a particular region.
Nazi disrespect for archaeological truth was finally extended to the sites themselves.
The SS archaeologists that were active in Poland excavated, partially excavated one of the most famous Iron Age sites there, a site called Biskupin. And when the tide of war started turning against the Germans in the east, the SS pulled out of that area. One of their last acts was to destroy the site almost completely, which you really can only interpret as an act of vandalism and intentionally done in order to make sure that no one else would have access to it.
So compromised were some German prehistorians by their conduct under the Nazis that even now there is a deep aversion to any archaeology connected to the events of the war years. That aversion would be most dramatically illustrated when researchers discovered the long-buried headquarters of the Nazi secret police beneath the wartime rubble of Berlin. Uncovered in 1985 near the old Berlin Wall, the most feared address in Europe was once 8 Prince Albrechtstrasse. It was here that thousands of prisoners were tortured in the cells of the German secret police, the Gestapo. It was here that plans were drawn up for the extermination of European Jewry. And it was here that Heinrich Himmler dispatched his SS archaeologists across Europe. Not surprisingly, no German archaeologist was willing to excavate the site.
Archaeologists would not want to get involved, many of them at least, in this excavation because it brings up the question of the Nazi past, and part of that past was archaeological investigation under the auspices of the SS.
We all know that Germans don't like too much to be remembered, to remind their Nazi history, because you can say that the whole German people were involved in this history, and that's one aspect. But the second aspect is that this special site, the Gestapo area, it reminds of who has planned the whole system and who has organized the whole system. And in planning and organizing, it shows that thousands and hundred thousands of people were involved in this system. It's another point of view to see it from this side than to be, for example, in a memorial of a concentration camp, where when you come there as a visitor, you can identify with the victims and feel very sad and say how terrible that has happened. But at the special side of the Gestapo center, you have to ask why that could happen. It's the question for those who did it and those who were involved and those who supported it.
Without money or official assistance, the excavation of the Prince Albrechtstrasse site was left to volunteers and an architect.
I suppose there's always a connection between material and idea, or Vorstellung, it's imagination. You can take a cellar in Pompeii, but you must know that it was Pompeii, you know. And this is only masonry of an old building here. It's a cellar. But you must know it was a center of the SS Staat. And it was the real center of terror, of the terror of this time.
Today, a temporary museum sits atop the site. The recent upsurge in violent neo-Nazi activity in Germany is convincing many that only by preserving locations such as the old Gestapo headquarters and fully exploring the part archaeologists played in the Nazi period can history's lesson be fully learned.
If archaeologists were in the forefront of the preservation of these areas and their development as teaching tools, this would be a major contribution and in some ways almost a compensation for the role that archaeologists played to foster some of the ideology of the Nazi era and some of their reluctance to be critics of the pseudoscience that was part of the race program for the Nazis.
The Faustian bargain struck by German archaeologists with their Nazi masters remains a cautionary tale for people everywhere. Tyrants will always try to rewrite the past to serve their own brutal ends. And archaeology must be vigilant not to become a tool in the pursuit of dangerous and arrogant national myths.